I get clay out of an area in Starr, North Carolina. It's down below Seagrove. There's a guy named Takaru Shibata who manages Star Works Ceramics, and he's I think a chemist background. He really knows his clay, so he's taken clay from all over North Carolina, mixed it. They call it wild clay when it comes from different parts, right out of the ground. They process the clay, they break it down into a powder form, they sieve it, screen it to get all the rocks and roots out of it, and reformulate it, and then they add one type of clay to another type of clay to get a formulation that does what you want it to do in the kiln. So I get all my clay now from them. I used to get it out of a place up in Asheville. I don't dig my own clay. It's pretty intensive, and I don't have a source for it around here. So I take the clay right out of the bag. I'll re-wedge it to get the molecules straightened up in the clay. It's a lot of technical things to it. But I'll just take the clay right out of the bag or out of my pug mill. I recycle all my clay. If I have scraps, I'll recycle it. As long as it's not fired, you can rework it. So making something on the wheel, I'll just start with a ball of clay. Throw it on the wheel. That's why they call it throwing. A friend of mine in Seagrove called throwing clay. He threw a piece of clay at me. He said, we turn down here in Seagrove, so I guess I need to throw some. I wanted to be an artist all my life, so I took every opportunity I could growing up in high school, middle school. Wound up going to School of the Arts for one summer session back in high school, and I studied design and drawing there. I knew I wanted to go to college one day. I'm the first on my dad's side of the family to ever go to college, so I'm a first generation college student. My family is an agrarian background, farming, carpentry. My grandfather was a sharecropper. So I've got that history to live on, hard work ethic. But I knew I wanted to go to college and try to become an artist, a real artist. So I started out in graphic arts and did that for a year or two, and then thought maybe I need to change to art education. I liked working with kids, and went down that track. But at the same time, I was taking a pottery class, and I fell in love with clay, and it all fell in line after that. I started doing anything I could find out about clay, visiting galleries, talking to other potters, visits down to Seagrove on my own, talking to some of the old timers. Wound up going to Penland School of Arts. I guess it was about my senior year in college, and it changed everything. I worked with a guy named Michael Sherrill, who's internationally known potter, clay artist, and he rocked my world and let me see what other possibilities are out there. Sculpture, I have a sculpture background too. When I was in college, I minored in painting and sculpture, as well as majoring in ceramics. So then after that, I got out of school and thought I was going to rock the world, and reality set in, and I had to get a real job somewhere else that was not art, and just to survive on. So it's been a long process over the years to get to where I am. A little equipment, finally built this studio, dream studio. Took years to get all the equipment, but I've been doing pottery for now about 33 years since college. And I've done sometimes full-time and other times part-time. I've worked other jobs. I've been a recovery analyst at Nations Bank, wearing a suit and tie to represent the bank in court. I worked on my dad's farm for a while. I worked my last job. I had to get my sons through college. I went back to school and became an EMT, so I was a hospital EMT in the emergency room. Saw a lot of death and bad things. So now, after this past year and a half, I'm back to pottery full time. This is what I love. I figured I've got maybe 10 or 15 years before I have to retire. I want to spend the last 10 or 15 years giving it all I have. So it just felt right. It was a material that I could kind of sculpt using the wheel or hand building. Just felt, earthy. Felt that connection to the earth. You use, fire. I guess I'm a pyromaniac at heart too. I don't know. There's so many possibilities with clay. that maybe you can't do with wood. You can't stretch wood. You can't stretch metal very easily unless you have a foundry. My professor in college he always said, clay is your friend. Clay will be there when no one else is. Clay is forgiving. You know, you can start over. So it's just something I fell in love with, just feeling the clay between my hands. Sometimes I'll have an idea of a shape. Most of my inspiration comes from old historic pottery. I love the old stuff. I love the pots made in the 1800s there's a handful of potters out there that I really like. Heimer Fox is one that comes to mind. J.D. Craven. There's so much of a tradition in North Carolina for pottery that you just have a huge amount of people to fall back on to look at their work, see how they did it. If you're lucky, you get to hold something somebody made from a long time ago. And they were just phenomenal. They could make hundreds and hundreds of pots a day back then. They didn't have telephones and all that occupies so much of our time. Life was just different. So trying to mimic some of the things that the old timers did, I love and enjoy that. I love their shapes. There's just a truthfulness to it. They made so many and had to make it to be used that they had to make sure it was not too heavy. Once it was filled with water, you didn't want it to be heavy to begin with, so they had to get their thinness just right. The shape, you didn't want it too soft up here or too thin because it would break when it's used every day out in the barn, kind of thing. So I appreciate the old timers' work the most. A lot of people ask me if I'm related to the famous coal potters of North Carolina. And my answer is always, I'm not sure. I've talked to a lot of the older Coles that are now all deceased, and they thought maybe there was a link. My father's side of the family goes back to the year 1745 in Sanford, North Carolina, which is about an hour and a half from here south. And we've got a long family history down there, but not of potters. Other potters live in Sanford and Seagrove in that area with the last name Cole, or used to. And maybe there's a connection somewhere, but I don't have it. Still working on that. There's so much involved with glazes. Glazes mature at different firing temperatures, so there's different formulas. You take mostly some base ingredients a glass former, a flux agent, and a colorant. And there's many recipes out there on the internet, just like making a cake, but they're all dependent on the type of clay you're using. They might or might not be a good fit for the clay. I might have one that actually forms a crust of glaze too fast on the outside, and it will be brittle, and it will cause cracks throughout the surface. So you have to really formulate and do a lot of test tiles. So I do a lot of test tiles. I'll take let's say a base recipe that everyone's familiar with, and I'll change the colorants, or I'll try to make it a little more glossy or a little bit more matte or waxy. And you have to do a lot of recipes, just like making a cake. Do a test tile and then put that in the kiln to see your results. Sometimes your results are bad, and you just don't use that anymore. You could take let's say an orange, and you could put a different colorant to make it more red or make it more brown. So many variables. It's hard to explain without just showing you, making up a recipe. I use a gram scale. I usually make 100 gram batches just to make a test tile. But my final might be in a 5-gallon bucket. And then again, you may find a glaze you love, and 10 years from now, the materials coming from the mine are dug way further back in the mine. So they change a little bit. And all of a sudden your pottery starts looking different, and you realize that the chemicals have changed slightly because of the mining process. And you've got to go back in and do new test tiles to try to achieve that same color. Sometimes you can't ever get it again. There's such a rich history here, and there's so many exceptional potters just in North Carolina. I think we're known as the state or the capital of pottery for the United States. And you can go to areas in Europe and Asia, of course, and find the same thing. But North Carolina is famous because we had so many clay deposits that were natural here. The potters, I think, from Moravia, from Pennsylvania, came down here because of the clay. People just settled into the area where they could find the best materials. So we've got Catawba Valley on the other side of the state. Down in South Carolina, the Edgefield district. Edgefield, South Carolina is famous for its clay deposits and potters down there. So big history, long history. Right now I have a reduction gas kiln. It's 30 cubic square feet inside. The kiln I chose was a downdraft version where the burners are blowing upwards, but it crosses inside and goes back down through an outside hole in the back of the kiln, basically, so it causes it to be an updraft eventually out the chimney. Just get a really good atmosphere in there. I went for years with just electric, and you get kind of tired of that. So I've told everyone I was reduction starved. And once I got my reduction kiln, now I want to do wood firing. So I've got my shelter built for that. I've got bricks, I just haven't built my kiln yet. Sometimes it takes several hours to build the pieces. I'll do it in sections to make a taller piece. When I'm doing something like a mug, I try to go with repetition, and I'll have my balls of clay all the same weight. I'll weigh them out. I'll try to make, my goal is 100 mugs a day. I'm not there yet. I think the most I've done is 75 in one day. Mm-hmm. So you just kind of, you get in there and do it. It's hard to tell how long it'll take. You have interruptions, you have different things that you have to work on. If you're firing a kiln at the time you're turning, you have to go back and forth and check. So the days are always different. But it's fun. You plan your own day, and usually something else happens, and you just have to kind of go with it. I like to make things that are useful for the kitchen: pie plates, mugs, casseroles. But at other times, I like to make something that's more, artistic. Going back to my sculptural background, sometimes I'll use slab work, incorporate that into wheel work. One of my buddies in Raleigh calls it artsy fartsy. I'm getting artsy fartsy with clay, but it's such a great material. You can do anything with it. Whatever your mind can imagine, you just try to make it, and you learn as you go. A lot of mistakes.
What's your favorite kind of pie?
Chocolate pie.
Yeah.
My clay in here usually to keep it from drying out. It's in the bag right now, it's moist, but as I work it, I'll try to keep it in here with moisture. The refrigerator's not turned on. It's just to keep it from getting dry. This is my electric kiln room and glaze. I mostly bisque fire electric now, which is the temperature of a flower pot. You're doing that so it will be less brittle when you handle it. When you glaze something, the glaze will absorb into it like a sponge. So I do all my bisque firing now electrical, and then glaze it and then refire at a higher temperature. All the glazes I have here, these are test tiles. Did this bottom row this last year. They were all, I was taking a base glaze and trying to change the color. Just by adding a little bit more or a little bit less of the oxides or the colorants. Some of these I'll never use again, but I keep detailed notes so I'll either can remake it or never use it again. So I keep stacks of books and got a mess in here. This is all my chemicals I keep. They're all powder form, very dangerous to breathe. You can get silicosis, which is a form of cancer, lung cancer, if you're not careful breathing this stuff. So I've got a waterfall spray booth I had built. I can turn that on in waterfalls, and I can spray my glazes into the water past the pot, and it recycles the glazes I can reuse again. So sometimes I'll get a larger amount of the scrap, and it'll be a nice green, so I'll use it until it's gone. There's so much to it. There's so many variables. I'll set the scale up for 100 grams. Right now it's just a balanced bowl, and I'll take let's say I'll follow a recipe. These are recipes, some I've come up with, some I've gotten off the internet, some I've gotten from old books, and sometimes they'll come out similar to what the potter intended, but many times because your clay is different or a different color, you have to change and adapt. So I'll take, let's say, custard feldspar. I've got a recipe over here I'm going to follow just like I'm baking a cake. You put 3 eggs in and some oil, or in this case I'll put custard feldspar, 29.3 grams. So I'll measure out 29.3 grams, and then I'll put my powder in of that one ingredient, and then I'll dump it into a larger bucket with water so that it absorbs quicker and doesn't create such a dust cloud. And then I'll go to my next ingredient, and you go down the list until you have all those ingredients, and that's just about a solo drinking cup size that you make a test with. And I always try to run the test before I put it on a pot, because you can ruin a lot of work. Let's say I work for a month and make a lot of things, and then I glaze it, and the glaze doesn't come out good. That's a lot. That's 2 or 3 months of work ruined. So again, it's just a matter of some are poisonous. Some of these you don't want to lick your fingers, or really most of it you don't want to eat around it. But you're going to have it in powder form. A teaspoon of that, they say, will kill a full-grown man, so you don't ever want to ingest it. Be very careful. And I'm not gonna do anything in front of you in here without a mask on and the room atmosphere being sucked out. But gram scale is the biggest tool I use in here. I'll use spatulas. I'll use a drill, paint mixer on a drill to make larger buckets. You have to sometimes use a hydrometer to make sure your viscosity is the correct balance. You don't want the particles to settle in the bottom. You have to stir it up a lot. Other times you have to use muriatic acid or sodium silicate or bentonite. Additives in small amounts will cause the clay particles to float inside the water. It's called flocculating. You want to flocculate most of your glazes so that it goes on even, it doesn't settle. If you get the amount wrong, sometimes it will deflocculate, and your stuff will be like hard ooze, goo in the bottom of your bucket. There's so many variables. It's such a learning process when you work with clay, or just about any art medium. You're gonna get better and better and better. But with clay, you're always learning how to fire something different, to make it different, use a different kind of clay. So you're using chemistry, you're using your artistic part of your brain, physical work, labor. It's a good feeling to accomplish something, and it drives you to the next step. You want to do this so you can get to this next step. I want to get all this certain things done so I can start wood firing. I've heard an old Japanese man, it was like 101 years old, they asked him, how long have you been doing this? He said, all my life. And what drove him? And he was like, the clay. It was just the clay drove me. And he said, maybe when I'm 103 I'll know everything. So he was still learning at that age. He didn't feel like he could learn. You know, he knew it all.
So where do you hope that this will take you in the future?
Just the satisfaction I get out of working with my hands, sharing what I know. I'll do this until I can't physically work anymore, until I die. I'm just going to do this. It's the artist in me. It's part of my soul. I think I just want to get better and better and better. I want my work to be more natural, you know, to have a look like it's just really fresh right off the wheel. Just to improve on what I already know, make my pots thinner, taller, bigger is fun. But I see doing this the rest of my life. A lot of people, you know, plan on retiring when they're 65. I can't retire. I'll do it if I had nothing else to do. If I was crippled, I think I would still try to find a way to make pottery. If I was disabled, I would still at least try to teach other people, you know, just my faith in God is my biggest push. And just like the other day, I was able to share some of my pottery with a guy that I met out here working on my barn. His mother-in-law had cancer and his girlfriend had cancer, and he was a broken-hearted person. He was really struggling, and I was able to encourage him and then share my pottery with him, tell him about my faith in God and how God will get him through. And that to me is, in a nutshell, that's my life. I need to glorify God with whatever I do. He's given me the talent and the ability. He's given me the resources over the years. He's blessed me with my space and the time to do it. And financially, you know, I've never missed a meal. There's sometimes we really struggle as a potter. Most potters never get rich, but they do it because they love it. And if I can share my faith with people and help lift them up, then I know I'll do it the rest of my life, and that's kind of my passion.